We're recording now as well, correct?
Yes.
I'm going to leave. Love you, Lenore. Take care, my dear.
Yeah, love you too, Jeff. We'll be talking.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and make some announcements. So my name is Rachel Hassna. Welcome to our Law and Mental Health Didactic Series. I am with the University of New Mexico's Department of Psychiatry, Division for Community Behavioral Health. In terms of CEUs, so the CEU process is such that to qualify for CEUs, you need to attend the entire hour of the lecture. In the chat, we will put a link. Click on that link or copy and paste it into your browser and fill out the evaluation. A certificate of completion is automatically generated. It is your responsibility to save a copy. If you're on your phone, you'll want to screenshot the document when it comes up. And if you're on your computer or your laptop, you'll want to save a copy of the document to your desktop. As for the PowerPoint slides, Dr. Walker has graciously agreed to share her slides, so I will be sending these out as well as the recording link, probably by the end of the week. So everybody who's registered and or attended this will receive the link to the recording as well as the PowerPoint slides. I believe that's everything, and I'll pass it over to Julie.
Thank you, Rachel. I'd like to welcome everybody to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Didactic Series. This series hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. We're so glad to have you join us here today. My name is Julie Brovko. I'm an assistant clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. So first I want to remind you that next week we have Candace Shields, who's going to be presenting developing informed opinions about the likelihood of incompetent defendants attaining competency to stand trial. Next, I want to let you know that we'll be generally holding questions until the end of the talk. Please ask them anytime you feel comfortable, but just note we're not going to get to them until the end. And finally, for those of you who are on a tight schedule but still need your CEUs, I will let you know when the hour has passed. We will likely be staying on longer to address questions, but to qualify for CEUs, you only need to stay for that full hour. So now it's time what we've all been waiting for. I'd like to introduce to you our speaker for today, Dr. Lenore Walker. Dr. Walker is a pioneer in studying the psychological impact of interpersonal violence and trauma. She began her early work when she was on faculty at Rutgers Medical School at the University of Medicine and Dentistry in New Jersey in the early 1970s as an early feminist psychologist studying child abuse and battered women. Her later research, named the Battered Woman Syndrome, she helped introduce it to the courts around the United States and the world. In the 1980s, it was her work on battered women syndrome that helped battered women who killed their abusive partners in self-defense have their testimony admitted in criminal trials. Later, she modified it to assist those with battered women syndrome in civil and custody cases, and then for sex trafficking and rape victims. She has been involved with the APA governance and helped formulate policies on various forms of gender violence there. And today she chairs the working group on professional practice guidelines. Dr. Walker has an independent practice of psychology. She's been doing that for many years and has been the director of the Domestic Violence Institute. Although she has now retired from her long academic career, she continues at Nova Southeastern University's College of Psychology as a professor emeritus. She also maintains a small forensic private practice specializing in cases where gender violence issues are raised, and she's a keynote speaker and consultant around the world. Dr. Walker has published over 20 books on psychology covering women's issues, gender violence, and forensic psychology. Her most recent is Battered Woman Syndrome, 4th edition in 2017. And in 2018, she has 2 new books in press, one co-edited on sex trafficking and one co-authored with her husband, Dr. David Shapiro. She's a master clinician and trainer and has joined together with Rachel Needle to present the new trauma program for innovative professional CEUs. To learn more about Dr. Walker and all of her activities, I'd like to encourage you all to check out her website, drlenoreWalker.com. Dr. Walker, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and New Mexico's Behavioral Health Services Division, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for presenting today. We're so grateful for your time and expertise, and now I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Julie. I'm really very excited to be here. I don't get a chance to always talk about feminist issues, especially when we're talking about forensic psychology, because it's been so male-dominated for so long. But we're going to do it today. I'm going to give a little history that gets us to this place and then go over a couple of the topic areas. So my objectives, as you can see on this particular screen, is that by the time we're finished, I hope everybody will understand that what is gender bias, from what is feminist jurisprudence, which is a form of jurisprudence or the law that deals with these very specific feminist issues. And I hope we'll be able to identify at least 3 of those gender areas where psychologists can offer assistance to the courts, and some of the strategies to understand these psychological issues involving gender, but doing it from a feminist perspective. So those are the objectives, and let's go right into what is gender. Most of us understand that gender is a socially constructed role, and it encompasses all the behaviors, all the attitudes that are seen in a particular society as being acceptable, appropriate, or maybe even desirable behaviors that are based on biology or on perceived sex. And it's generally, gender bias is if there's a particular preference for one sex over another or one gender over another. So gender then is actually the socially constructed role, whereas sexuality or sex is the biological role. So the bias, gender bias, can be conscious or it can be unconscious, or in most cases, it's both. Now, we've got some challenges coming up to us, those of us who have been studying a lot of the issues around gender, because it's changing. We used to believe that there were only 2 sexes, biological sexes. But when we talk about gender ideology, we're now looking at it from a gender non-conforming continuum. So we go from heterosexual or cisgender through lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, questioning, or queer, or whatever designation people have. We are going to have trouble with that when we start to talk about some of the things I'm talking about today, because that's really based on male-defined roles and female-defined roles. But for today, we're going to stick with what we've got. Just want to call your attention to the fact that life is changing, and we're going to have to be changing with it. So feminist jurisprudence began just around the same time that feminist psychology began developing in the 1970s. Two names to be associated with them, the original feminist jurisprudence I have up on the slide. Susan Jordan, who dealt with a case called Inez Garcia, or she was a rape victim. I'll talk more about her later, from California, where she was raped by two men who were drug dealers in her neighborhood. They knew her. They raped her, left her on the street, and told her that if she ever told anybody, they would come back, find her, shoot her, and kill her. She went home, like many rape victims, felt dirty, took a shower, went out got a gun. She had a rifle in her house, got a gun, went out looking for those guys and shot and killed one of them. In her first trial, she pled self-defense, but if she would have shot him when he were raping them, when they were raping her, it might have been self-defense, but not when you go back and shower, wash, take time, and then go look for them. However, she was able, with Susan Jordan as her defense attorney in her second trial, the first one was overturned on some legal issues, she was able to demonstrate that these guys could find her at any time. And so we began to look at some of the definitions of imminence and imminent time periods. This will be important later when I talk to you about Battered Woman Syndrome defenses. Anyhow, Susan Jordan and Elizabeth Schneider, who was from Brooklyn Law School, really did some of the first writings on feminist jurisprudence. And they really looked at several areas that were very much necessary to look at the bias between women and the bias that was occurring against them. And these included violence and crime. I mentioned rape already, and domestic violence, reproductive rights, intimate relationships, children, employment, and education. So I can't do all of them, but I figured I will go over a little bit of history, and then I'll talk about a few of them. So in the 1960s, as many of you may have studied or remember, we had some major women's movement changes. We had a lot of organizations that were forming. Some dealt with things about what women could and couldn't do in their homes, such as the National Organization of Women, which is still around. Some of them, like the Women's Equity Action League, dealt with equal pay and credit for women. RBG, our wonderful US Supreme Court Justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, was instrumental. In fact, I actually worked with her when I was at Rutgers as a student, a graduate student, in the New Jersey Wheel organization at the time. Feminist activism was really going on in the 60s and early 70s. And at that time, the divorce laws changed as well, and we'll talk more about that. There also, in the 1970s, was the United Nations Decade for Women, and that brought about a lot of other changes for women. And in 1972, the United States Congress did put forward the Equal Rights Amendment. As you know, we think we have enough states to pass it now, all these years later, but we'll see what happens. One of the most important dates, I would say, in 1972 was a psychologist named Phyllis Chesler, who wrote the book Women in Madness and talked about how psychologists tended to keep what they called uppity women on pills and depressed, rather than getting them to really see why they were feeling so oppressed. Domestic violence laws, rape laws, and we had gender bias task forces in the courts. And all of the, or most of the state Supreme Courts set up a gender bias task force to look at where there was, they called it gender bias, but they really were looking for bias against women in the courts during those studies. I was trying to find one of the old studies, but I think when I left my office, I closed my office at the university. It's in some box packed somewhere, but I used to have a bunch of them and they were fascinating to read. So one of the first areas that I want to talk about is women and work and discrimination, because this was an area that psychologists were very much involved in early on. We're still fighting for equal pay for equal work. As you know, we've gone from 59 cents to now the last I saw was we're up to about 79 cents that a woman gets paid for the same $1 that a man will work for the exact equal work. When I started, even when I was a graduate student, I couldn't get credit in my own name. I was married and I had to have credit in my husband's name. Today, any woman who is credit worthy can get credit in her name, but that was not so in those days. Jobs were based on ability and not gender, but they were listed in the want ads in the newspapers, male jobs, female jobs. So that all changed. And it changed because of legal battles. And in 1991, we really got some strength in the equal opportunity laws. The EEOC clarified sexual harassment cases and race discrimination cases. One of the most famous ones, for those of you who want to look it up, is the Price Waterhouse case, where a woman was denied promotion by a partner who, unfortunately for Price Waterhouse, said his nasty comments about the woman so that they could be recorded. He put it in writing. And it was found because she was, even though she brought in those days about $500,000 worth of business for the law firm, she was too aggressive. And he said she should go to a finishing school if she wanted a promotion to a partner. She took the case to court, and it was one of the psychologists' testimony, both there and then before in Congress. Psychologist testimony was very important in showing that there was bias against women at that point. Before Congress, it clarified in federal sex harassment cases that sexual harassment is possible to cause harm to any woman, not just a particular case. And that was really important, because if you testify in a sex discrimination or work discrimination case, then you do not have to prove damages. All you have to do is prove that the sex harassment happened. And of course, there are certain ways that you do it. We don't have time to go into the step by step, but I've given workshops on how you do each of these cases. You lay them out, and today we're still doing them. The Me Too cases are using the same kinds of legal arguments that psychologists can offer the courts the information about what's happened. Now, some of the Me Too cases are in state court. Not all sex harassment cases can either be in federal court, or if the state, like Florida and some of the other states, have their own sexual harassment laws, you could choose to go there. Why people do that depends on what the case is, but in the state, you have to prove harm as well as prove that there was a bias, that there was gender bias that occurred. In federal cases, as I said, you just have to prove that it occurred. It automatically is harmful, but federal cases usually go up to about $250,000. They may be a little bit more now, I'm not sure. So if it looks like they want to go after more money because it's more egregious, or there are more women defendants, plaintiffs rather in the case, they may choose to do that. But it depends. And we've done a lot of testimony in my offices on these kinds of cases. And we've started to get involved in some of those, what they're calling now Me Too cases. So you can see it's an area for some of you who are interested in it to develop some proficiency. The next area I want to go on to, and I'm sort of hopping around from area to area because we don't have a lot of time, and I want to give you just some good overviews of the field. That really has dealt with a lot of gender bias has been the changes in divorce laws. Now, this has been very interesting because the gender bias task forces were not finding bias against women. They were finding bias that were raised by dads, saying that they were being discriminated against in both custody and in who pays how much money for child support. And so the whole laws were starting, and rules and regulations in these cases had to be changed, and they were changed state by state by state, you know, where we have to do it very slowly in the United States because it's not federal court. Now we're in state courts. Now women are finding that they're being unprotected, especially when there's domestic violence in court. A brand new study I cited here on this particular slide by Joan Myers and her colleagues looked at over 1,000 decisions, judicial decisions by judges in custody courts, and found if a mother raises the issue of domestic violence or child abuse, particularly child sexual abuse by the dad, she's at least 50%, and in some cases, 75% likely to get no custody of her child. Now, this is important to think.
Hello.
Hello. How are you?
I'm fine. Let me make sure I got this.
Sorry about that. So this is important because what we know about the divorce changes when we moved to no-fault divorce back in the 70s and the best interest of the child standard, many of the states put someplace in those laws something about the state policy being reunification of families. It didn't really consider domestic violence or child abuse at that point. And so kids have no legal rights in the United States. We'll talk about that later. They can get a guardian ad litem in some cases if the court will appoint a GAL, but the GAL's responsibility is what is the child's best interest, not what the child's wishes are. And that's a whole other lecture that I'll do some point as to why we don't have those legal rights that might be really important in looking at some of the problems that we have in family court. I just finished writing an article. If people want a copy of it when it gets out, I'll send you the link. So what happened is Judith Wallerstein and Joan Kelly did some very limited studies about shared parental responsibility or joint custody and used very white middle-class standards, evaluated a small sample of kids and decided that joint custody was good. Well, it looks like it's pretty good for kids. It's in their best interest if the parents agree. But in many cases, if they'll force people into joint custody or shared parental responsibility, it doesn't work. And we've got a whole host of new mental health workers with all kinds of names, child custody evaluators, time sharing people, a variety. Every state has different names for them, who now have to force people into sharing when they don't get along. And of course, if there's domestic violence and child abuse, it's not good for the children. So what this happens now, even though we have in the 80s, we criminalized child protection and abuse cases. So psychologists have a lot of work here, but the problem is there's still a huge amount of gender bias. As I said, we are rarely protecting women and children. We're using, fighting things like parental alienation syndrome or disorders and things that really don't have the kind of research that psychologists would prefer to see. Okay, so I've done enough on that. That's one of my pet peeves, are the divorce cases and family law cases. And I think the new concept of TJ, or therapeutic jurisprudence, maybe we need to look at just redesigning how we split the baby. But that's, as I said, that's for another lecture. So let's go on to reproductive health. This is an area that's been fraught with politics. And of course, lots of things that psychologists get involved with have a lot of implications with politics. The issue around contraception and abortion laws are continuous. I particularly have been testifying in many of the cases. Today, the testimony is not really done in person. We're doing it mostly by affidavit, but every year new states pass new laws that are trying to restrict the original Roe v. Wade case that passed back in 1972. So you see, the 70s were really a very important part for those of us who were doing gender kinds of psychology. We have lots of research showing there is no such thing as post-abortion syndrome. Yes, some people have problems after an abortion, but these are the same people who have had problems prior to an abortion. They don't seem to exacerbate it. Nancy Russo and other psychologists have published some really important research. We fought very hard in federal court to make sure that teenage girls who got pregnant, if they felt that they could not tell their parents, oftentimes because there was domestic violence or child abuse in the home, that there would be a judicial bypass. You could go to a judge, and a judge could listen to and review the case, and oftentimes had psychologists' testimony. So we have really fought for it, but there's still lots of discrimination because of people who have resources that can afford us and people who don't. Another area, which we don't have time to go into, but again, another great area for a webinar, is on the new reproductive technologies. When I teach the psychology and family law class, I love that particular area. I mean, who gets to use the newer assisted reproductive technologies? For example, two people try to become pregnant. They can't become pregnant, so they go to a doctor who helps assist them. The woman has her ovum removed, which is now a surgical procedure. The man gets to contribute his sperm. They get fertilized in the laboratory, and we have what's called a fertilized gamete. They often, because it does have difficulty in, and it is intrusive surgery, we tend to, the technology tends to remove a number of ovum and sperm and fertilize a number of gametes. So they may implant the ones they're using right then, but they may freeze them. And then the couple, maybe 4 or 5 years later, decides they're getting a divorce. Who gets control of those gametes? Certainly, if the woman gets control of it and she decides to have another child, this man could be forced to pay child support for the rest of his life. So there are battles now over gametes. Are they property? Are they a person? Depends on whether you think when conception occurs. You see the politics that gets involved. So psychologists have been involved. I've been involved in some of those cases. They're fascinating cases. And if you look at the law over time, you'll see that it really has some oops, we're going backwards. Some real interesting changes in the law over time and how those decisions are being made by judges. Many justices who really, judges and justices in the appellate courts who really don't know very much about it either. So it's testimony that comes from both medical professionals and from psychologists as well, because some of the decisions have been who it's going to harm the most. And so then you have to figure out, well, what do we mean by harm? And how do you define that? So another area for those of you, I know we've got a lot of graduate students who are on today. So here's some areas for you little niche areas if you want to look at. So let's move on now to the gender violence cases. Those are the cases that really many of us are involved in. We've been doing lots of research in that area. I list the 6 major areas that we've been looking at that we call gender violence. As I said when I started this lecture, we may have to redefine some of them as we look at what is as our redefinitions of gender are. But for now, we're gonna look at rape and sexual assault. We're gonna look at domestic violence, at child sexual abuse, at sexual exploitation, sexual harassment and discrimination, which we've looked at already, and sex trafficking. So let's, I talked a little bit about rape and sexual assault and the Inez Garcia case in 1977. Joanne Little is another case that was very similar. She was a New Jersey woman who was in jail for some I don't remember, it was not a major crime. And one of the deputies in the jail had an ice pick and raped her using the ice pick. I don't remember whether he actually raped her or he attempted rape, but the ice pick dropped. She picked it up and stabbed him and killed him with it. And she was found not guilty by reason of self-defense. Interesting, but because she had no place to go, she was in custody and he was the jailer. That again was one of the early feminist cases on what's a woman's self-defense. And we had to redefine self-defense. And we had a number of state courts. It took about 20 years. I testified in about 36 states with the cases of first impression because they didn't want to have somebody whose credentials were not already approved. So I was written up in the law journals and just traveled around the country looking at some of these cases. One of the early, so I started with, had been doing some research on battered woman syndrome at the time. So I started testifying. The 2 earliest cases was Joyce Hawthorne, which was really my very first case, which happened to be here in Pensacola, Florida. She got 3 trials. Each time it went back to the appellate courts and she got a new trial because of legal issues that were raised. But finally, the APA wrote an amicus brief saying, wait a minute, battered woman syndrome and the effects of battered woman syndrome happen over time. It's not just one incident. You know, our criminal laws say we prosecute each incident independently. But when you talk about psychology and the psychological effects of what happens to somebody psychologically and their fear and how it increases fear over time, then you need the whole history. And so that's why we changed some of those self-defense cases to allow the history rather than just the one incident. And the Hawthorne case and APA's brief, which is still up on the APA website for those of you who want to look at it. I have my classes all read some of these old cases because they are very informative, because it helps you understand what are you looking for when you do an evaluation. And if we have a little bit of time, I have some slides with a case study. I can show you how I put all this stuff together to testify. The second big case, Joyce Now, was a state case, and it took until 1984 when she was ready to begin her fourth trial, and the judge said, wait a second. Her lawyers made a motion that this was cruel and inhuman punishment to go through 4 trials for the same homicide that occurred, and the judge granted her I guess it wasn't a not guilty, he just null-pressed the case, and so she was free. All this time she was out and raised her family. She was not held in jail, so she had lawyers, but she had resources. That doesn't happen. And she was not of a minority group. Important area to think about, especially today as we think about who ends up in jail and in prison and who ends up waiting out their trials at home. The second big case was Beverly Ibn Tomas, and this was a federal case. How did it turn out to be federal? She killed her abusive husband in DC, Washington, DC. And at that time, Washington, DC in the 1970s was under federal law. Now they have their own legal system, which is equivalent to state law. But at that time, it was federal. And so it went into the federal system. It went into all the reports. And I testified, or I tried to testify, and this case, they didn't let me testify in, but they made a proffer of the case. And it went up on appeal. And during the appellate process, they found that that the average juror doesn't understand battered woman syndrome or domestic violence or the psychological impact from domestic violence. And therefore, because it was beyond the ken or the knowledge of the average juror, you could have psychological testimony if the psychologist was properly credentialed. Interesting. That opened up the way. But we still had to do state by state by state cases until the 90s. Sometime in the middle 90s, it was pretty well established in most states, but some states actually had to change the law to allow it in. And it's been allowed in most of these states, if it's in the law, by calling it battered woman syndrome. A lot of psychologists feel that that's too narrow. It should have been a bigger definition. But, you know, when you're doing this kind of trailblazing work, you really don't know how that's going to occur. And the last case in that group that I want to mention is Gladys Kelly. That's a Washington state case, although there also was a Gladys Kelly in New Jersey a case as well that APA entered an amicus brief in. But the Gladys Kelly case in Washington state was an important case because the justices in the Washington State Supreme Court ruled that defendants were allowed, that it would be a malpractice by an attorney if they did not get a psychological evaluation for somebody who says that she was battered by her husband and that it was she claimed self-defense. And at that point, we had another case which allowed the states to pay for people to get an evaluation. Unfortunately, there wasn't always a good evaluation or somebody who knew about domestic violence, but at least it was a beginning. The Wanro case, which I mentioned as well, was another domestic violence case. Here, this was a woman who believed that She was had a broken leg. She was sitting in her house. This is also a Washington State case in the same, I think it was the same Kelly court at the time. And in one row, she was babysitting a bunch of kids. A next door neighbor had a reputation of being a child molester. Whether he was or not, we never knew. He called and said he was coming in. She told him, "Don't you dare come in, I've got a gun." He said, "I'm coming in." She got her rifle. She's sitting on the chair. He opens the door and she kills him. She blasts him and kills him. And so she claims self-defense. She had a broken leg. What could she do? So the case goes up to the appellate court. And again, the same, I think it's the same justices wrote a beautiful opinion saying women have a long history of not being trained to use parts of their body to defend themselves. So they may need to use a gun, even with a man who doesn't have a gun, even if a man who's armed only with parts of his body. I don't know if that would hold today, because many women are much better trained in martial arts and different ways of defending ourselves. But this is back in the 1980s, and that was a very important decision that was used by lawyers in other states as well. So those are some of the kind of history as we have been looking at some of this. Now, the child abuse, sexual abuse cases, since that's been criminalized, psychologists are there testifying as to how you do interviews, doing the evaluations, and testifying as to their findings. Again, too many of the people who are doing this work are not well trained in understanding what damages can occur, because so many little kids especially don't show the sexual abuse effects right away. I'm involved in a legal case now, which is not a criminal case, but a civil case, where people who have been sexually abused over a 20-year period are now banding together in a lawsuit against a school district for failure to supervise a teacher properly who sexually abused them in the classroom. So we have a lot of work. Unfortunately, this is not unusual. There are a lot of these cases that are right there for well-trained psychologists who know how to do these evaluations. And sex trafficking, which is the last area that I want to mention here. These are cases where we've now changed a lot of the laws. We're not arresting, particularly teenagers, for prostitution, as if we believe that they've been sex trafficked. And so in addition to treatment, we also can do evaluations and help testify in the courts. We've had a few cases where women have been arrested for actually being the trafficker. And that's a very interesting area for a feminist like myself to get involved in, because we don't want to believe that women can become, who are victims can become the victimizer, but they can. And the question is, do you hold them responsible, especially if there's the major sex trafficker who's above them and who's watching and pushing them to do what they're doing, and they do get benefits if they follow. So they're very interesting, and we can maybe talk a little bit about some of your feelings about those kinds of cases. So that's a kind of an overview. I thought I'd spend a little bit of time talking to you a little bit about self-defense cases. I see we have a little bit of time to be able to do it. Let me tell you what we look for, and then I have a case that I'll put up and I'll go over it very quickly so that we'll have some time for questions as well. So here in the Battered Woman Syndrome cases, we talk about the fact that, yes, Battered Woman Syndrome is not a diagnosis in and of itself. It's a subcategory of PTSD, but we use it because it, as I said before, it permits the testimony for the entire relationship, not just that particular time. And we're looking for, what does she have a reasonable perception of imminent danger? Reasonable for the reasonable person defense, which had to be changed to the reasonable woman defense, because reasonable person was always a man in a bar fight, you know, with taking out the, remember the old Westerns. So we had to talk about, how does a woman defend herself? And then how does a battered woman defend herself? Each state had to make a decision. Do you want an objective definition of self-defense? That would be a person. Do you want a quasi-objective, subjective definition? That would be a woman, a reasonable woman. Or do you want a subjective defense, self-defense, which would be everything that she knew at that time? So if you're doing these cases, you have to know, you have to work very closely with the attorney so that you know what you're looking for when you're doing your evaluation. What was in her mind at that time? What can she remember? What can you help her piece together? Because oftentimes, as you know, PTSD includes re-experiencing fragments of other incidents that have happened, especially in domestic violence when there've been more than one incident. So you've got to help her piece together, not just what happened that moment, but what's in her head at that moment. Not easy, but those are the way you have to do that kind of evaluation if you're really being fair. And of course, the way I do it is I look at the cycle of violence and I look at drawing a timeline. I'll show you one if we get a minute or two. And we want to really look at humanizing the woman. No battered woman is perfect. They all do things that we probably, if we were looking for perfection, would say she shouldn't have done. But that's who she is. And that's our job, is to show who she is, try to explain even the counterintuitive things that happen in domestic violence relationship, and look for the trigger. Why now? Why this time did she get so scared? And we administer psychological tests. I usually use the PAI, the Personality Assessment Inventory. I use the Trauma Symptom Inventory, the second edition, and I use the Detailed Assessment of Post-Traumatic Stress, the DAPS. We can do them all online now, so this is terrific. I like to use the WACE because, remember, much of what we do in criminal work has to be knowing. It's what's a cognitive defense. Yes, we can talk about emotional kinds of disorders and how that affects what she knows, but it has to be cognitive based. And so I like to use the WACE, but we can't do that here now. I was on, some of you may have been on, Bruce Frumkin did a webinar a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about using parts of the WACE, and I haven't tried it yet, but I'm thinking about trying to do some of that to see how much I can get from that. So it's an interesting area. We're always looking for people. We do some training of people who want to do this work because it's tough. It's tough work, but it's rewarding when you really can help explain and figure out. It's like a puzzle, you know, and if you really enjoy forensics, then you enjoy figuring out the puzzle. So where are we going with the future? I'm going to do that, and then I'll go into I'll have to switch slides to show you the case. Well, I think we're going to have not just looking at sexism, but we're going to have to do more in terms of looking at how racism and sexism intertwine in feminist jurisprudence, just as we're doing it in feminist psychology right now. Although we've always been doing it, intersectionality has been a term that we've been using in feminist psychology for many, many, many years. We have to look at the intersection of race, culture, gender, socioeconomic status, as well as violence, all of which are important. We need to look at not just changing laws. You can see how women have made a lot of progress by the laws changing, but we haven't made a lot of progress with attitudes yet, and we go back and forth. Politics is a perfect place to see where attitudes haven't really changed yet. And then we need to look at the relationship of child abuse and how that affects all the other societal problems. The more I do this work, the more I really think that if we stopped, figured out how to stop child abuse, we would empty out some of our prisons, and I think we would really feel a lot more, well, we'd have a lot less work. I often say that's okay. I want to sit at a beautiful beach, and if we don't have any more violence. I'm afraid that's not going to happen in my lifetime, but I'm still trying. So here's some, you're going to get these slides. You'll see here's some literature that you might want to take a look at. Dave Shapiro and I have just published our new textbook, our second edition to the forensic psychology textbook. We take it from the clinical as well as the social perspective. Most of the other textbooks in forensics only use the social psychology, but we do both. And we took on Dr. Stephanie Ackel as part of our team with that. David and I also published last year the forensic practice for mental health clinicians, so that we really talk about 10 different areas, I think, maybe more, I'm not sure, not just the feminist areas, but of all the areas that we do in forensic psychology. And the fourth edition of the Battered Woman Syndrome book, and then it doesn't have the date, but Giselle Gaviria and Kalani Gopal and myself edited a handbook on sex trafficking from a feminist transnational perspective, because we're looking at crossing the border. So I'm gonna, I have enough time. I think I have enough time to just quickly show you. I'm gonna stop sharing these slides, and I'm going to put up the next set of slides. Oh, I'm always so happy when it works. So this is a client, we'll just call her Nikki, not her real name. And it's an old case. So, you know, there are some changes. I'll tell them to you as we go through them. Oh, I got a slideshow. Here we go. Okay, so if I were looking at Battered Woman Syndrome, by the way, we've got a BWSQ, the Battered Woman Syndrome questionnaire, which we now will share with people if they want to look and see how we're defining Battered Woman Syndrome. We don't have time to do that today. But here are here are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 areas. We now have 8 areas from our research. The 4 areas for PTSD, and then we look for disrupted interpersonal relationships, distorted body image and physical health issues, and sexual dysfunctional issues. And we look at dissociation, which our research showed. We would not have thought that dissociation, we know it's present, but we didn't realize it was part of the actual BWS statistically. Here I talked about a timeline. You know, my work looked at a cycle of violence where you can draw it on a graph. A lot of people draw the 3 phases, the tension building, acute battering incident, and then loving contrition. They draw it in a circle. I draw it on a graph with the vertical axis usually going from 0 to 10. This one says 12, and the horizontal axis being time. And then I plot the amount of danger either the woman or the woman and I together will rate for each of the incidents. And here are the incidents over a 5-year period from 1994 to 1999 in this particular woman's case. And I show how it's escalating. I've got this slide ready to testify if we go to testimony in court. It's very powerful when you can actually talk about each of those incidents. In addition, I use the whole issue of learned helplessness and power and control factors because domestic violence is an abuse of power and control. And here are some of the ways I do it. I talk about these 7 areas, about having a look for the cycle. I look for sexual abuse in the relationship. I look for power and control factors, torture, and I use the Amnesty International definition of torture. Threats to kill her and others, and different kinds of violence correlates. Did he try to hurt other people, kids? Does he destroy property? And alcohol and drug abuse. And then I go over each one of them in testimony, but I've got that chart. And we don't have time to go through each of them. But you can see I've got this all prepared for me when I go up to testify, and the attorney's got a copy of it as well. And sometimes I actually write on the on a chart. I like to write on charts rather than on a whiteboard because they can take it into the jury room with them if the judge lets them. But sometimes they don't want to do that. Sometimes they have the money, they make the charts up themselves. So we can do all of that. Here's some of the torture things that I do. So I've got it all outlined for myself. Here are some incidents. So I'm ready to say this is power and control, and I give an incident that suggests it. Here's a PAI. In this particular case is an interesting case that I use for training because I tested her twice. Once in I think it was 07. I'll look at it in a minute. And once in 2011. And her scores. This is the PAI. Again, I have it up on the board so that I can go over it. Yeah, 07 was the other time, and I compare the two. Here's the TSI in this particular case. Again, I explain to them what this measures. And this is the one in 2011. And this is the DAPS profile. You can see that for many of them, not unusual for there to be some real high scales that in some people think it makes it invalid. I say interpret it with caution in some of the cases because they do have very unusual experiences. Remember, the test was not standardized on people who actually killed their abusive partner. We're doing with Bob Geffner, we're doing a journal on women who kill. Very unusual. So anybody who has some literature in that, some research, let us know if you're interested in. Yesterday was the deadline, but if somebody says they were on this webinar, I'll look at it. And so here are the DAPS summary scales. Sometimes I put them up, sometimes I don't. Again, I listen to the attorney and what the attorney wants to do. Here are some of the power and control factors. And these are some questions that are important in some of the cases. And so it depends on the case. And I compare it with some of my research or some of the research that's been out there. And sometimes I actually do a PTSD, help the jury help make a PTSD diagnosis. And I explain it and show them how I make the diagnosis. So it doesn't seem like it's such mumbo jumbo, but that our testimony is really based on some data. Okay, I think we're gonna stop with that. I'm sorry it's so fast, but at the last minute I thought, well, maybe you'd be interested in it. Okay, I think we stopped. Nope, I gotta stop sharing. There we go. Okay. So I think, Julie, if we have some questions.
We sure do. Okay. Let's start with this one. Just like with rape trauma syndrome, what do the courts cite as their reasoning for keeping battered women syndrome out? Like when it fails to pass Dauber, what do courts cite as the reason why, and how do you overcome that?
Well, in my experience, battered woman syndrome rarely fails Dauber in criminal cases because we use the cases that have gone before and that say that a woman is entitled to that as a defense. Sometimes if it's it can fail because the person who is not qualified, or they make some claims that the testimony doesn't show. You know, unfortunately, there's a lot of lawyers who don't know what they're doing. And some psychologists who take on these cases and really don't know what they're doing with them. So, you know, we've had psychologists on the opposite side who claim that there is no such thing as battered woman syndrome. Well, of course there is. It's in the literature, but there is no diagnosis. So you have to, but there is a diagnosis in the ICD, even though it's not in the DSM. And so you have to know how to explain that it's a constructed diagnosis under PTSD and how you do that. So those are usually what happens.
The next question is, are there any validity scale elevations of the PAI like the NIM or on the trauma symptom inventory that would lead you to conclude the test profile should not be interpreted due to the strong possibility of symptom exaggeration or fabrication?
Well, I don't have any patterns, but I look at that very carefully. And I look at, sometimes I even go further and look at what are the questions that seem to be inconsistent with what I'm being told in the clinical interview. So there are times when I think there's such inconsistency. And sometimes I have clients, more recently I had a client who was a very strong alcohol user. And I really think that she had some severe neurological components. And I told the attorneys that it might be there, but unless he gets a neurological evaluation or a neuropsychological evaluation of her, that I don't think we can really tell the difference between what it is and isn't. So, you know, I think each case has to be looked at very independently, but definitely look at the validity scales. Oops. I don't know what happened here.
You good?
Yeah, I don't know where I went. I'm clicking to exit the slideshow, but I don't seem to be able to do that.
We don't see any of your slideshow right now. We actually just see your...
Oh, can you see me? I can't see
Yeah.
anything. So I don't know what we're doing, but okay. Oh, no, okay.
Do you press your escape button? Lenore, you should be able to, whatever screen you're in, if you just hit the escape button.
Yeah, it's not doing anything. Oh, yeah. Oh, wait. Well, I can see myself, but I don't see it. I don't see Julie. So
That's okay.
Well, we can see you fine. We see you.
okay, then just go for it. I can hear.
Okay. So the next question is, are you aware of any articles to cite regarding criminal defendants with PTSD being more likely to fail NIM or F scales? In this individual's experience, defendants with PTSD routinely elevate those scales, and the research that she knows of is with non-criminal populations.
Yeah, no, I don't know of any. I don't know of any literature. Anybody who has any, I'd love to take a look at it, because there are so few women that have been administered. You know, women who kill, particularly, who have been administered these tests. We've now got about 100 I have 30, Dr. Geffner has about 40, and we have another psychiatrist who has about 40. So David is going to start looking at doing some analysis of it, but we have not found any literature on it. We have one article on the Rorschach, which has its questionable, depends on what jurisdiction you're in, whether you can use it or not.
So in line with testing questions, I've got two about the waist. So the first one is, can you explain in a little more detail how you use the waist or other cognitive measures in battered women syndrome cases? And then the next question is, how do you relate the waist to the specific cognitive issues related to trauma?
Well, with the waist, I like to look at several things. Number one is I like to look at the pattern of intra as well as inter related responses. If somebody tells me that they were sexually abused as a child or physically abused as a child, I want to see if there are holes in their knowledge. You know, oftentimes I call them Swiss cheese kids, where they fail easy items but pass harder items because they're of attentional kinds of issues. So I'm looking for that. I'm looking for judgment. So depending on some of the subscale analyses of some of the answers, how are they using their rationale? I'm looking to see, let's say I have somebody who gets a PhD and now on the waist really does very poorly. Well, I'm making the assumption that maybe she's had 20 or 30 years of an abusive relationship that has affected her cognitive abilities. So I'm trying to look at how those test scores. I'm looking for, you know, some of the on the waist. Some of the things that are dependent on memory and how those are affected. So I'm really taking and dissecting it in terms of what each one of those subtests are supposed to measure, in addition to the whole test itself.
So for those of you that need to hop off but needed your CEUs, it is right at the hour. So please make sure you click on the CEU survey, fill that out, take a screenshot or print the certificate. Just remember, we do not keep copies of those for you. We are gonna stay on a bit longer to answer questions. So the next question is, does identifying yourself as a feminist ever work against you in court? That is, you being seen as less than neutral.
Of course. I try not to identify myself as a feminist in court, but, you know, I've written so much that says feminist on it, I can't hide it. And so generally what I try to do is to present a little cognitive dissonance. So like I might ask I hate to say this to a whole group, big, large group, but I'll say it anyhow. But, you know, I might do something that's very feminine. I might wear something that's very frilly, or I might have a bow in my hair. So I'm presenting a little cognitive dissonance. I don't want to look like what a feminist is supposed to look like in people's stereotype minds. Or I might ask the prosecutor to get me a glass of water, or, you know, I might smile sweetly at a man, or, you know, I just try to do some silly things sometimes. I wrote about this in one of my books, and of course, some smart prosecutor many years ago took the page out of the Terrifying Love book and blew it up and said, "Is this you?" And I had to say, with this little sense of humor, and I think that's what I tried to do more than anything else, is to just be pleasant and to use, you know, a kind of sense of humor about it and say, you know, and I said, yes, I did write it, and I really thought I was going to make so much money on this book that I wouldn't have to ever testify again. and you know, it kind of broke the you know, the mood. So you have to be humble when you get up there, and if you make a mistake, you have to say, yeah, I made a mistake. Yeah.
Can you briefly touch on why you use the DAPs as opposed to other tools like the CAPs?
Because I got used to it. I like PAR iConnect, so I continue to use it. But I think you can use any of the tools that do the measure that you're comfortable with. I don't think you need to use one over the other. I will say I use the PAI rather than the MMPI because the PAI has a much better PTSD scale. If somebody does not come out having significance on the PTSD scale on the PAI, I can't say that they have PTSD because I think statistically it's a pretty good scale. But the MMPI, you never know what you're going to get with PTSD. It's great for other things, but for PTSD, the PAI, and I also like the fact that the PAI has independent, each one of the clinical syndromes is independent. You're not mixing them as the MMPI does. I'm interested to see what the new MMPI comes out and whether I think they may have cleared up some of the issues that they've had. But they really have not done a good enough job as far as I'm concerned, with the PAI, with the PTSD. And, you know, I'm chairing the PTSD professional practice guideline committee. And so I'm really seeped in PTSD literature. And measuring PTSD is complex. It's not easy to do. And you really have to spend time trying to figure out that our tests are not that sensitive. So you've got to have that clinical sensitivity that you develop. And I think you only develop it by case after case after case, frankly. That's how I learned it, and it's how I train people.
Given the research regarding the frequency with which batterers threaten to harm or harm their victims' pets, and many victims delay in leaving the home due to fear for their pets, do you typically query about pets?
Yes. Yes. In that violence correlates section, we ask about pets. We ask about, and when I do trainings, I suggest many battered women shelters have arrangements with veterinarians who will board a pet when you can't take a pet into shelter. Because pets must be protected. They're family, they're furry family, and many people don't want to leave because they're terrified, and they're rightfully so. Batterers, unfortunately, we know the Humane Society has done some good research on it, and batterers do hurt pets, hurt kids, they threaten kids, and they destroy property. When I do you know, trying to do a safety plan, I try to tell people, you've got to take property that's really, if you have heirlooms or something that really means a lot to you, protect it, because he'll smash it if you leave. But you know, that's for another lecture.
Do you know of any quick screening tools for assessment of factors of the batterer?
Well, we have risk assessment instruments. I use Jackie Campbell's dangerousness scale, which is something I use with these battered women cases, the self-defense cases too. Of course, it's post-dictum, but it gives you an idea of how dangerous, how many of those dangerous factors that Jackie Campbell's research has shown. So I think that's a good tool. She also has a good risk assessment tool. Well, some people use the SARA, but the SARA is not a test. It's really just an assessment instrument where it tells you how to collect data. A lot of the battered women shelters, though, use it around the country so that there are some data that you can use to check out what you're getting as to what other people, whether it's commonly seen in other people.
This next question was a little confusing, but I think I'm going to pull the meat out of it. Do you think that public school sex education plays any role in maybe gender violence Yeah, I guess that's the question. Do you think differences in public school sex education has any role in maybe differences in gender violence across the country?
You know, I haven't been following what schools are using for sex education, but you know, my attitude is always the more knowledge you have, the better off you are. Now, if you have somebody who's teaching sex education, like I remember back when we had some drug programs, they were terrible programs. And so if it's a terrible program and if it's a terrible sex education program, that could be a problem. But otherwise, I would think that the more awareness people have, the better off they are. Certainly, both women and men need to be trained in how to treat one another. And violence is never acceptable. It's not acceptable for a woman to use it. It's not acceptable for a man to use it unless it's in self-defense. And I think we have to be very clear. You know, I don't think little kids should be running around using fake guns. You know, but that's my own prejudices. That's my bias.
Regarding intervention, which modalities have you found effective in treating associated symptoms that you've mentioned today from Battered Woman Syndrome?
Oh boy. Well, for me, you know, I use a combination. I've developed a program called the Survivor Therapy Empowerment Program, the STEP program. And it's a combination of using relationship issues along with some DBT and some CBT. I sort of throw in a little bit of everything to the program. I think that CBT types of programs are good for dealing with some of the symptomatology, but they're not good in terms of the relationship issues. And if you saw the Battered Woman Syndrome, I know I did it very quickly. One of the damages is in the relationships that people have had. Because the batterer is so jealous that he often interferes with those relationships. So I think it's really important to do a little bit of both. And of course, feminist issues. So it's a combination. We're just about to do the 3rd edition of the STEP program, and it's going to be available commercially. As soon as I can get to it.
Are you aware of a book written by a journalist about female CEOs?
There's lots of books about CEOs. I don't know. I need more specific.
Okay. And then somebody's asking if you're familiar with work that Erin Pizzey did with Warren Farrell.
Well, I know Erin Pizzey. In fact, Erin Pizzey was one of the first people I met back in the early, I think the mid-1970s. In 1975, I went to England to see what she had set up. I had read about her work in Ms. magazine. And then I brought her to the United States. The federal government gave me some money to bring her here when I was in Colorado at the time. She's quite a character. And then Erin retired. She was never really a trained therapist. She just kind of put it all together. She had opened up a shelter, and had some ideas were really good, but some of them were a little not psychologically based. Let's put it that way. And then she went off to Italy. The last time I saw her, she was in Italy. This is maybe about 10 years ago or so, and she was writing sexy novels. So she's quite an interesting woman.
All right.
I'm writing mystery novels right now, so some of you can be on the lookout. That's my real passion these days.
Well, thank you very much. Looks like we have exhausted our questions. We're so grateful for your time today. Thank you very, very much. And For those of you that are still on, we will remain on for a little bit longer for you to fill out your CEU surveys. Remember to take that screenshot or print out your form because we don't keep a copy. But again, Dr. Walker, this was wonderful. Thank you so much.
It was lots of fun. Thank you too.
All right. See y'all next week.
Thank you, Lenore.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Jeff.
Lenora.
Thank
Been
you, Lenore.
great.
Okay, folks, I will set a timer for 2 minutes for any questions related to the CEs. They are in the chat. If you need me to resend them, please let me know. Otherwise, thank you all for tuning in to today's webinar. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Okay, I'm getting some feedback that the chat is disabled. It should be at the bottom of the screen since the presenter is no longer doing a screen share. Oh, okay, cool. They got it. Bottom of the screen, it should be right next to the green share screen button. Please refer to there. Okay, Patri Williams, let me, okay, cool. Yes, the presentations will be taking place once a week, every Tuesday from noon to 1 Mountain Time. We look forward to seeing you then. Okay, cool, they got it. Cool, chat is disabled, he got it. Okay.
Yes, the chat is disabled. If you have questions, you can submit them in the Q&A.
Oh yes, she means you can't type in it, but you can still access it. Okay, folks, I will stay on for 1 more minute to assist with the CEs. They are in the chat. If you can just click on it and then click on the blue link, it should take you to your web browser to access it. Otherwise, it's in the Q&A. Some that answered it, the link is not available via a link. You just have to copy and paste it into your web browser, and then it should take you to the evaluation link website. I'll set the timer on my phone right now. Okay, folks, I will be signing off now. Thank you all for tuning in once again. Have a good rest of your day. If you have any questions related to the CEs, please send an email to them. Oh, time is up. All right, thanks everybody. Have a good rest of your day.